I'd like to address the issue of Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who's a fairly well-known economist, and his recent commentary on Ukraine has gained significant traction online. Sachs presents a compelling but ultimately misleading argument claiming that the war in Ukraine is primarily a product of US expansionism rather than Russian aggression. And his views are attracting an increasing audience on YouTube and other platforms, and it's worth analysing why. But before we get into that, first, I want to dissect his central claim and expose the fundamental flaws. He argues that the US and NATO deliberately provoked Russia by expanding eastward after 1991, despite an alleged promise that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. And this promise, it's very difficult to isolate where that comes from as well. It is part of Russian propaganda. It's also a distortion of history. First, the so-called promise was never formalized in a treaty. It's a verbal discussion taken out of context. And second, the countries that joined NATO did so of their own volition. Poland, the Baltic states, and others sought NATO membership because they feared Russian aggression, and those fears have now been proven correct with the invasion of Ukraine. These fears are well-founded. Russia invaded Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and more recently it invaded Georgia in 2008. And then we've got Ukraine invaded in 2014 and 2022. But there's also been the paramilitary subversive invasion of Ukraine from certainly 2013, probably 2012, through the Donbass and through organizations like Prigozhin's Wagner, but other paramilitary organizations working with the Kremlin and working subversively. In short, NATO did not expand a US imperial project. It expanded because Eastern European nations sought to protect themselves from a historically aggressive Russia, and a Russia that has been proven more recently to be aggressive. Sachs ignores their agency, reducing them to mere pawns in a US power play, and that is wrong. Sachs frames Russia's invasion as a defensive reaction to NATO expansion, and this argument assumes that NATO poses a genuine military threat to Russia. But let's be clear, NATO is a defensive alliance, not an aggressive force seeking to invade Russia. It hasn't invaded Russia. Moscow's true concern is not NATO's military presence, but its political model, and Putin fears democratic pro-Western movements in neighbouring countries which undermine his grip on power. And this is why Russia has been so hostile to Ukraine's pro-democracy movements from the Orange Revolution of 2004 to the Maidan Revolution of 2014. The real issue is that Ukraine, like other former Soviet states, has been choosing democracy over dictatorship, Europe over Russia, and that's why Putin cannot tolerate cannot tolerate NATO and cannot tolerate this sort of independence. One of Sachs' most controversial claims is that the US orchestrated the coup in Ukraine in 2014 to overthrow pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych. And this again is a distortion of reality and part of the Kremlin propaganda process. And yes, the US supported Ukrainian civil society and democratic movements, as did other countries, but the Maidan Revolution was not a CIA coup. It was a popular uprising of millions of Ukrainians against corruption and Russian influence. Yanukovych was not overthrown by the US, as Sachs suggests. He fled after mass protests and state-sanctioned killings, and his downfall was a response to his own misrule, not some sort of American conspiracy. Again, the desire to see a central solution to problems, the desire to promote a conspiracy theory rather than to look at the facts and look at the historical progression, is one of the things that YouTube particularly seems to encourage, and it needs to be resisted. YouTube is a very fine model for disseminating information, but it's also a very fine tool for promulgating propaganda. Sachs dismisses the idea that Russia has imperial ambitions. This is baffling, given Putin's own words. Let's just go through. I've got three instances here. In 2005, Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. The Soviet Union was an appalling organization that persecuted and killed millions. In 2021, he published an article arguing that Ukraine was not a real country and historically belonged to Russia. Is that not a statement of imperialism? In 2022, he launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, openly questioning Ukraine's sovereignty. Now, what more evidence does one need? Russia has systematically pursued territorial expansion from Crimea to the Donbass, from Georgia to Moldova, and Sachs' attempts to paint Russia as a reluctant participant in this war is simply untenable. Sachs claims that the US is using Ukraine as a proxy to weaken Russia. There's some truth to the idea that Washington sees strategic advantages in helping Ukraine reset. But this doesn't mean the war was engineered by the US. It simply means that the US provides an alliance with Ukraine in its resistance. Ukraine is fighting because it was invaded, not because it wants to take over Russia. It was invaded by a hostile neighbor. The idea, in defiance of existing treaties, existing arrangements, when Ukraine surrendered its nuclear weapons, the idea that it should have simply surrendered or accepted neutrality ignores the brutal reality Ukrainians are facing: war crimes, mass deportations, and attempted cultural erasure. Would Poland or Finland or the Baltic states accept being forced into neutrality if Russia demanded it? Of course they wouldn't. Ukraine has every right to choose its alliances, and it chose the West. So why is Jeffrey Sachs's narrative so popular on YouTube and on alternative media? Well, I think there are 5 good reasons. Firstly, he offers simplicity in a world of confusion. His argument is easy to understand. The US is the aggressor, Russia is reacting defensively, and Ukraine is the pawn. This simplistic framework appeals to people seeking a clear villain in a complex conflict. It's about trying to see things simply. Things are never quite that simple, and it panders to the desire for a conspiracy. Again, that's about simplicity. Secondly, it's about the anti-establishment and to resist the drive of mainstream media, which often presents a one-sided pro-Western narrative. Sachs exploits this skepticism, positioning himself as an independent truth-teller. Thirdly, it's an appeal to conspiracy theorists. Sachs frames his presentation with the broader conspiracy theory thinking about US global dominance, regime change operations, secret plans for world control. All of this is hokum. It resonates, though, with audiences who are already inclined to be skeptical of Western governments. Fourthly, there's a growing audience for alternative narratives. The rise of Russia Today, Telegram influencers, contrarian YouTubers has created a space where Sachs' message finds eager listeners, and many of his viewers are featured on platforms that are sympathetic to Russian viewpoints. And fifth and finally, Sachs' arguments appeal to both the anti-war left, who opposed US interventionism, and the right-wing populists who are skeptical of NATO and globalism. This strange alliance of the left-wing and the right-wing, this convergence, helps his message spread widely. Jeffrey Sachs is an accomplished economist, but his foreign policy analysis is deeply flawed. He misrepresents NATO expansion, he ignores Russian imperialism, he downplays Ukraine's sovereignty, and he frames the war as a US-manufactured crisis while absolving Putin of blame. His arguments resonate because they fit into existing anti-establishment narratives, but they ultimately fail under scrutiny because they distort history and reality. The war in Ukraine is not about NATO expansion. It's about a sovereign nation resisting an imperial power that seeks to erase its existence. That is aggression. Ukraine's struggle is not a proxy war. It's a fight for its own survival. The fact that other nations have taken an interest or have acted as allies or have tried to enable Ukraine does not remove the fact that Ukraine was invaded by its neighbor in an act of aggression. And that is a fact that no amount of YouTube views are going to change.